sisters, ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the national anthem of Trinidad and Tobago.
Words from the love of a liberty in the voice of hope and prayer, with boundless faith in our destiny, we solemnly declare.
Side by side we stand, islands of the blue Caribbean Sea. This our native land.
We pledge our lives to thee. Here every creed and race find an equal place, and may God bless our nation. Here every creed and race find an equal place.
And may God bless our nation.
Please sit. And welcome to the launch of the distinguished Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series for 2025. We have some special guests with us today, brothers and sisters. And as I look up, I see more. Starting with our government officials. I'm not seeing the Honorable Ambassador Penelope Beckles, Leader of the Opposition, who's supposed to join us today. Perhaps she will be here shortly. We have Her Excellency Natalie Campbell Rodriguez. That's from the High Commissioner for Jamaica. We have His Excellency Charles Marfo, Deputy High Commissioner. And that's from the Mission of Ghana. We also have with us among our specially invited, I see my colleague here, the ambassador from Mexico. Yes, indeed. Welcome. Yes. So I know there are going to be some people that I miss here because they're not on this list, but I will try to recognize you as we go along. Among our specially invited guests, in no special order, everyone here is important. We start with Dr. Claudius Fergus, Chair of the Trinidad and Tobago National Committee on Reparations. Let's give him a round of applause for his work. He's also the former Chair of the Department of History, is also a director of the History Making Caribbean Freedom Project. And I'm now looking up here and I also see our dear ambassador from Venezuela. Ambassador, I know in some quarters you may not be welcome these days, but you're always welcome here. Always welcome to here and your lovely family. We have Principal of the University of the West Indies, Professor Rosemary Bella Antoine, sitting right here. Let's give her a round of applause, please. Distinguished professor, engaged intellectual, as is Dr. Claudius Fergus. We have with us as well Professor Mark Woodivera. He is the Dean of the Faculty of Agriculture, if I'm not mistaken. There, brother. Hello, welcome. We have with us, and I want to say this is really important for us to recognize, the Black Power generation. And that's those men and women who were born under colonial rule in the 1930s and 40s, who demanded more fundamental and revolutionary change or transformation from independence through personal sacrifice, with some paying the ultimate price, laying that important foundation on which we will build a better future. We have them, some of them are still with us. And so whenever I have to salute them, I always want to call them out and make sure they are properly recognized. So we start tonight with Dr. Pearl Into Springer. Where is Dr. Springer? There, right there you are, Auntie. And I'll tell you, Auntie is the one who introduced me to Franz Fanon. I was sitting down next to her in what is today Zen nightclub. Of course, it was not a nightclub in those days. It was a cinema. And it was in the darkness there, and she was unhappy with something, as Auntie Into often is when she's a critical mind. And she turned to me and she said, son, from mere obscurity, every generation must find its mission, and they will either fulfill it or betray it. And that sent me on my journey to investigate Franz Fanon. Thank you, Auntie. Thank you very much. Brother Ray Braffett is here with us. He's the shepherd of the Spiritual Baptists. And we also have our brother Raul Simon, the shaman of the Warao people. We have Mr. Raul Gibbons. Uncle Raul, where's Uncle Raul? All right, he hasn't arrived yet, but we're looking out for you, Uncle. Dr. Yvonne Bob Smith is with us. She's a member of this community, important member. Dr. Ralph Henry. Dr. Henry, let's welcome him. Of course, I've looked around here and I see Brother Douglas Mendez, a famous human rights lawyer. And he's lucky enough to be sitting next to Roberta Clark, the daughter of his wife and daughter of Caribbean revolutionary Bobby Clark. You know, so let's welcome them. Another member of the Black Power generation. We're not fortunate to have him with us, but his memory will never die. From the ESC TT officials, we start with our very own beloved Zakia Uzoma Wadada, our director, executive chair. Our founding chair, another member of not just the Black Power generation, but the Black Power revolutionary. Went to jail for us in 1970s twice. Brother Kafra Cambon, welcome. His wife, Sister Asha Cambon, another member of the Black Power generation and revolutionary. Elder Ikino Moyo. Brother Elder Ikino Moyo is more than just a member of the Black Power generation. He is a spiritual elder from the 1970s, and he represents a part of that tradition of the Black Power Revolution that we don't talk about too much, still not written about yet, still not really discussed. But Brother Ikino would have presided over the naming ceremonies of people from my age group right up to my son's age group, and to perhaps to some of the grandchildren who are in the audience. He's a very, very special individual indeed. Brother Ikino, Elder Ikino. We have Sister Jacqueline Burgess. Jackie, Auntie Jackie, ESC. Lynette Joseph Brown from the Emancipation Support Committee as well. Sister Hazel Simonet, stalwart, executive member, long-standing. Mr. Gordon Paul. So we have many special guests, and we want to welcome them all. We also want to welcome all of the people who are not here today. This is being live streamed all over the world. And I can tell you that we have people tuned in South Africa, in Burkina Faso, in Ghana, on the continent of Africa, and of course there'll be other places as well, in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana, right? We have, and other countries that don't come to mind right away. I've done the list in my head. So we have all kinds of international organizations. The Black and Indigenous Liberation Movement, a platform that was recently developed for African people to cooperate with indigenous people. Historically unprecedented platform. They are tuned in out of Ecuador, right? We have organizations out of Venezuela. So many organizations. I want to welcome you all to this session. And of course, those people who couldn't make it today and who will turn on the YouTube or the ESC Facebook page and look at it later on, I want to greet you and salute you as well. And now I want to invite one of our special guests who I didn't mention yet. And of course, she is the program leader for the Academy of Arts and Letters, the Doctor of Culture and Public Affairs, PhD in Caribbean Literature, Dr. Francis. Dr. Francis, to bring greetings on behalf of the UTT. Welcome, Dr. Francis.
Good afternoon. All protocols observed. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to bring greetings on behalf of the University of Trinidad and Tobago at the launch of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series hosted by the Emancipatin Support Committee. UTT is celebrating its 20th anniversary. 20 years as a national university, 20 years of pursuing our vision to be the premier university dedicated to the socio-economic transformation of Trinidad and Tobago with global reach and international standing. I want to focus briefly on the social portion of socio-economic. For me, that is where UTT, and especially my unit, the Academy of Arts, Letters, Culture, and Public Affairs, mesh well with the aims of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. Social transformation in a former colony through education requires two very difficult things: providing access to education and dismantling the grand narratives of colonial hegemony that underpin our notions of progress and development. As for the first, ensuring access, Trinidad and Tobago has a stellar history of free education, including tertiary education. And for the last 20 years, UTT has opened its doors to all citizens who want to pursue higher education, with impressive graduates embedded in many industries throughout Trinidad and Tobago. Graduates serving as catalysts, change makers in engineering, fashion, art, education, and performing arts. Graduates helping the socio-economic transformation to formulate, foment, fruit. The second, dismantling grand narratives, is a much slower and often painful process. Here again, I must stress that Trinidad and Tobago has an impressive record of individuals challenging themselves and us to rethink the myths and half-truths imposed on us. People like Henry Sylvester Williams, C.R.L. James, George Padmore, Eric Williams, Earl Lovelace, Claudia Jones, Pat Bishop, Lloyd Bess. Oh, the names I could call. And of course, the lecture series namesake, Kwame Ture. You know, when I visited the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C., and made that trek from the basement up to the 3rd floor, when I bent that corner and I saw the larger-than-life Kwame Ture cutout and read on the plaque, "Born in Trinidad and Tobago," let me tell you, the pride I felt. UTT plays its part as well by facilitating the type of exchange you will have this afternoon with Professor Gordon's lecture, Decolonizing the Mind, the Relevance of Fanon in the Modern Caribbean. Through the Academy of Arts, Letters, Culture, and Public Affairs, UTT creates space for academics, practitioners, students, and the general public to teach and learn about the richness that is Trinidad and Tobago culture and society. We firmly believe that such a deeper understanding of who we are stimulates social change for the better. On a personal note, I want to congratulate the Emancipation Support Committee for continuing the necessary work of organizing all aspects of Emancipation Day celebrations. I have participated in the festivities for the better part of 22 years. I don't look it. Attending the Emancipation Village, marching in the processions, and taking advantage of programs such as this. In a world increasingly focused on optics rather than substance, the temptation to reduce emancipation to dressing up for a day is very strong. However, by continuing to host events like the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series, the Emancipation Support Committee is doing its part to promote the deeper, more complicated, and sometimes uncomfortable meaning of Emancipation Day: mental and spiritual emancipation. Or as Bob Marley put it, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. On behalf of the Board of Governors, Acting President Professor Stephen Joseph, and the University of Trinidad and Tobago, welcome to UTT campus at Napa, and please enjoy what is guaranteed to be an enlightening and enriching afternoon. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Thank you, Dr. Kayla Francis, Doctor of Philosophy, Assistant Professor, UTT. And, hearing about all the things that UTT is involved in, sometimes I wonder that our tertiary institutions, and perhaps this falls into Professor Antoine's court as well, if sometimes we miss the boat in terms of addressing some of the issues that take place in the country that need more space, that where those spaces are ideal. For example, the Prime Minister declares he's going to remove Columbus's 3 ships from the coat of arms. I wasn't aware that there was a debate at UTT about this matter. Was there one? Well, the thing is, we need more of those official debates in our tertiary level institutions, in institutions like NALIS and so on, where the public can come, where students, the future of our leaders of our nation, can come and understand the changes that are taking place in their midst. So I'm just inviting that discussion now that we have the relevant people in the audience, right? And I'm sure they're taking notes. And now, brothers and sisters, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I want to invite, and let me just say, all this work, this takes a lot of work to put on an emancipation, to lead an Emancipation Support Committee. It's a small committee, small organization, limited resources, takes tremendous work, and it's a year-round task. People don't really see all the things that go into it. And so when someone accedes to the level of chair of the Emancipation Support Committee, that person is one of a special member of our community that deserves our gratitude. So the best way to show that is to put our hands together and give a lusty round of applause for Sister Zakia Uzoma Wadada. Welcome. To bring greetings on behalf of the Emancipation Support Committee.
Greetings, everyone. I want to start by recognizing our elders in the room, our dear sister, Entupel Springer, Dr. Entupel Springer. Yes, she's also the Iyalode of Ogun, yes, for Trinidad and Tobago, and therefore we need to give her special recognition. I also want to recognize our founding chairman, the shoulders upon which I stand. I have had, I don't know if it is the privilege or the immense challenge of leading the organization following his tenure. So, you know, those are some really big shoes to fill. So I give thanks to the divine energies of life and the Orishas for giving me the strength and the courage and the determination to do the job that needs to be done. I also recognize Sister Asha, Dr. Asha Cambon. You know, this lecture series is her baby, and she works really hard to pull it together. So all the other members of the board of the Emancipation Support Committee, all the representatives of the Diplomatic Corps who have come to be here with us, thank you all so much. And I also want, of course, to especially recognize our guest speaker, Dr. Lewis. Thank you so much for taking the time and offering generously to be here with us today. Of course, our principals of our university, Dr. Kayla Francis. Please, I know so many of you I would love to call by name, but you know, time will not permit. But welcome to all of you for taking the time to share this important moment and important discussion. Because as we are all aware, we are on the process of emancipation. You know, 1834, the emancipation did not happen. It was the continuation of the struggle of our ancestors from the time that they were put in chains, and they continued that struggle. That physical liberation that took place in 1838 was part of this process of emancipation. Following that, we had to fight really, really hard just to get equal rights and justice, to be continued to be recognized as human beings, and you know, and to be granted the same rights and privileges of all human beings. But this process continues. So we have made some progress, and I never want us to underestimate the resilience of our people and the amount of progress that we have made. Because there is not an area of study or of action that Africans have not risen to the top, as far as I am aware. So we are an amazing people. And that's why we are the salt of the earth. That's why we are the people from whom all others came. And therefore, we have a responsibility to those that are yet to come to continue this emancipation process. And the point at which we are in is this process of decolonization and reparations, but understanding that there can be no reparations without decolonization. And that decolonization has to take place in our physical space. It has to take place within our minds. It has to take place within our spirits. It has to take place with the way we do business. It has to take place with the way we educate our children. So plenty of work to be done. But that is our focus at this time, because that is critical to the repairing process. That is critical to the healing of our people. You know, so we have been able to break the chains. We have fought for some rights and privileges and got them into law. But there are many other shackles from which we still have to free ourselves. And so we welcome Dr. Lewis this evening to start this conversation about the decolonizing of our minds, because we know that is where we face the biggest challenge. So thank you, Dr. Lewis, and we welcome all of you, and we look forward to stimulating discussion following Dr. Lewis's presentation. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Sister Zakia Wadada. And let me just, I'd like to recognize, I saw Professor Selwyn Kadru somewhere. And also, for me, one of the most important voices that we have in our society today, Sister Suniti Maraj. I'm sure I saw her as well. And I know today Trinidad was supposed to play the United States of America. Does anybody know what the score is? I think that game was at 3. But I say that because we have with us Sister Renee Cummings in the audience today. And why? Renee's father, Gali, all the achievements we've had in football, go back to the contribution of her father, Gali Cummings. So we recognize him today and welcome Renee as well in the audience. And now, brothers and sisters, let me invite to you a young poet whose work has taken him around the world, most recently to Paris in 2023. He is the author of the book, What Happens at the Edge of the World. Ronaldo Mohammed. Ronaldo, welcome.
Decolonize my language. To all the places where my Trini accent can't give me access, and to all the people who look down on the use of dialect, if my Trini accent could speak, it go say this: yes, I's a Jamet. I like the midday sun over UTT campus, hot, 1,000 degrees Celsius. I's them mass bands outrunning political correctness in Port of Spain. Can't be corrected, can't be tamed, can't be seized upon like a city under siege. I am the wretched of the earth, fanning the flames to burn down the empires. I am rambunctious riots, canboule burning in the mouth, chaos to enrage the bakers, them, devil's kitchen, Creole, everything chipped in. When I Trini talk, the words just walk out we mouth like they chip in, jovial and juve. These words, colorful and vibrant like peregrinade, each sing-song sentence, coagulation of syllables fleshed out from a bloody history. These words, a cluster of wild vines growing from the island of this mouth, place unknown, the heart of darkness, savage and uncouth to those who can't understand it. Yes, this mouth is Jamet. It will not be branded. The history too vast to fit within your bandwidth. I can't dip my tongue overseas and turn foreign, become freshwater Yankee. This language is poetry. Poetry of resistance and resilience. When they tell you English bad, tell them, yes, it better than the bard of Avons. I just speak in similes and metaphors too. I's the root, the rock, resolute like Malok's ancient rhythm interlocks scattered tribes. Continents intertwined, Pangea survives in the mouth. I is a reflection of the world before it was reshaped, remapped, redefined. Before I was considered unrefined, I was there in the belly of a whale. Among the blue whales, songs sung aboard ships and slave ships. I was there when the ships docked. I was there when you had to duck the blows. Keep your tongue tucked behind your teeth. I was the love way chanted anyway. Djembe rolling, warrior song beating against the eardrums of those opposed to freedom. I was there when the tongue and lips were cut out. And the sound bled back to black. Back to the beginning, back to earth. I was the sound, uprooted and planted, uprooted and planted, uprooted and planted, uprooted and planted in fields. I am what it feels like to survive and thrive and grow relentlessly. I's the Cersei vine, bittersweet. Don't need to be couth or cut or cropped out to be planted here. Don't need to be appropriated to be appropriate and find meaning. Here is the language still surviving. Is the love way still surviving. Is the voice of the people in the height of the struggle. Is the power of the word in the rhythm of the word. Rhapso, calypso blooming in the mouth. Syllables dancing a dingole. I carry the essence of a people, picked apart in the Atlantic by a mercantilistic madness, their bones washing up in a swash of words, resurrecting themselves in the chasm of a mouth, ready to sprout limbs and grow. Yes, I know. I's a Jamet, unruly and free, and I go grow wild and defiant in all the places the ships are docked, and I go redefine them. I's ancient song still lingering in your mouth, the rhythm that tells you, come, 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 and expand and explore in all the places that tried to colonize you.
They're asking the expert on my left if Jamet is a gender-specific word. But that was a great poem. Thank you, brother. Let's give him another round of applause, folks. The culture is so important. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Asha Cambon. Let me just say 2 words about Dr. Cambon. You know, when you think about the 20th century, the left is defined more by discord than cooperation. And when I say the left, I'm talking now about the women's movement, the workers' movement, and the movement for racial justice. In our own country, if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, you will see that those 3 movements were all together. There was a time when, in the early 20th century, when we didn't have that problem that the rest of the world had. And the best example I could give you is Sister Elma Francois. Remember that name? Sister Elma Francois was the Pan-Africanist leader. She was the workers' rights leader. She founded several of the trade unions in the country, and she was also a leader for women's rights. At the same time, she saw no contradiction in those 3. Of course, today we will ask Professor later in the conversation. Somebody's going to ask Professor about the Fanon's position on this question that we hear so much between the discord between the workers' movement and the racial justice movement, where one critiques the other as identity politics. We're going to ask Professor what Fanon has to say about that, and I'm sure many of us will be eager to hear the response to that question. But I say this because my mother comes from that early 20th century tradition of activism that defined Elma Francois' work. She sits really at the intersection between the women's movement and the racial justice movement. And of course, her affinity is to the working class always. And so, last but not least, let me say that, and for those of you who don't know, my mother probably has raised over 30 children, many of them not her own. And if they didn't have enough room in our house to take them in, we didn't have enough guest rooms, they'd just come into our rooms. You know, so we learned to be very welcoming as children. Thanks to Mommy. And of course, on behalf of all those children, we say thank you with a round of applause and welcome Dr. Asha Cambon.
His mother, and I said it better be right because, you know, mothers. Okay, all protocols having been observed, it is with distinct honor that the Emancipation Support Committee brings to you this, our 26th edition of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series, convened in the name of our beloved brother, Kwame Ture, son of the soil, previously known as Stokely Carmichael. Following Kwame's transition in 1989, we changed the Emancipation Lecture Series to the KTMLS, with Dr. Kathleen Cleaver as our inaugural speaker. Kwame introduced me to Kathleen at his bedside when I visited before he left for his last journey to Guinea. From then, under the guidance of our beloved brother Tracy Wilson, who has also made his transition, the ESCTT has brought to the people of Trinidad and Tobago distinguished scholars and activists such as Dr. Tony Martin, Dr. Asa Hilliard, Dr. Leonard Jeffries, Dr. Nzinga Heru, Professor Ivan Van Sertima, Professor James Small, Professor Emerita Dr. Maureen Warner-Lewis, Professor Dr. Rupert Lewis, Professor Dr. Hilary Beckles, and Dr. Lisa Abry. Among our guests was Dr. Cynthia McKinney, who, as a US Congresswoman in 2008, almost lost her life trying to take food aid to Gaza, much like young Greta Thunberg, who, together with other humanitarian activists, attempted some 17 years later. This group had their boat intercepted in international waters by the Zionist regime. This may not be remembered by many, but it was Frantz Fanon's wife, Marie-Joseph Doublé Fanon, called Josie, the guardian of Fanon's work, who successfully lobbied the publishers of Wretched of the Earth to remove Jean-Paul Sartre's preface to the book after he signed a petition supporting Israel's pro-Zionist positions. Josie wrote that Sartre's pro-Zionist support was incompatible with Fanon's work. Thank you. We meet at an auspicious moment in our people's history, and we humbly acknowledge the 84th birthday of Kwame Ture, celebrated at the end of this month, the 100th anniversaries of the births of Brother El Haj Malik El Shabazz, Malcolm X, and our son of Caribbean soil, whom we gather to celebrate this evening, Frantz Fanon. It is also the moment of transition of an African literary, anti-imperialist, and decolonization giant, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. If you have not read any of his works yet, this is a good time to just pick up one, any one. Allow me to read a brief segment of a long tribute to Ngugi from Brother Femi Akomolafe, a Pan-Africanist author and activist who works on the continent. And I quote him. He said, "Dear ancestors, we send you Ngugi wa Thiong'o, son of the soil, prophet of the page, warrior of words. Receive him with honor. Let him speak in Kikuyu and be understood. And let him teach, even among the stars. Fare thee well, Mzi Ngugi. Say hello to your fellow revolutionary Frantz Fanon, who liberated me psychologically as you did culturally and spiritually," unquote. Tonight's discussion, Decolonizing the Mind, the relevance of Fanon in the modern Caribbean, is also a nod to Ngugi. We welcome all those present with us at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, Port of Spain campus, Theatre One, and to our listening and viewing audiences at home, in the wider Caribbean, and the global diaspora. Kwame Ture lives through our remembrance of him and his work. We have called and continue to do so for the renaming of Oxford Street to Kwame Ture Street. It is the street on which he was born, named Stokely Carmichael by his parents, and lived till the age of 11, before he was taken to North America to join his parents. Notably, the house still stands, is maintained in good order, and attracts many foreign visitors who wish with due reverence to see for themselves the place of birth and earliest home of the most iconic figure of the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 70s. Kwame's deep understanding of the challenges facing our people to end colonialism and neocolonialism continues to inform the work of the Emancipation Support Committee today. His rallying call, Black Power, made from Greenwood, Mississippi in June 1966, reverberated around the world, and we in Trinidad and Tobago heard it too. And we rallied Africans and Indians and all non-white people to regain the power of self-knowledge, self-definition, and self-determination, and the pride and belief in our aesthetic, our artistic creations, our cultural retentions, our cultural practices, belief systems, way of speech, natural hair, color of skin, song, dance. We expressed our solidarity with others fighting with the struggle against neocolonialists and imperialists, Africans in America, Cubans, our Caribbean sisters and brothers, people of Vietnam, Palestine, Algeria, India, Ghana, Martinique, Guadeloupe, South Africa, Zimbabwe. This movement in Trinidad and Tobago, the Black Power Revolution of the 1970s, sought to remove the vestiges of colonialism, fulfill the promise of independence, and bring real power to the people. The brothers and sisters of the time would argue that such a revolution must result in transformed power structures, give people, women and men, the power to manage the country and its resources for the benefit of all. There must be transformed governance processes, economic, social, and cultural processes. The Black Power Revolution in the Caribbean physically ended with the murder of Maurice in 1983. So we are reminded today that we also celebrate the 46th anniversary of the Grenada Revolution. Kwame left us with the notion that the primary and fundamental emphasis of this work for people's power should be expressed in people's organization. Quote, not ad hoc mobilizations, but permanent, effective, systematic organization. Organization for us to correctly interpret the true nature of our lives and to educate the people as to what we are fighting against and what we are fighting for, unquote. This evening, in that tradition of continuing the education of our people, the Emancipation Support Committee is honored and pleased to bring to you a most distinguished and in-demand speaker. Took me about 2 years to get this brother here. To address us on the topic, decolonizing the mind, the relevance of Fanon in the modern Caribbean. Before I say a little more about our honored guest speaker, I would remind all that Fanon holds a special place in the minds and hearts of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. During that 1970 period, young men armed with dictionaries sat under street lights, deciphering the meaning of Fanon's words so that they too could be part of heralding a new world order. Our distinguished guest this evening is the author of an amazing array of books and articles. Allow me to name just a few: Black Existentialism and Decolonizing Knowledge, published in 2023, Fear of Black Consciousness in 2022, Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization, 2020, What Fanon Said, A Philosophical Introduction to His Life and Thought, 2015, Fanon and the Crisis of European Man, Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism, 1995. He works in the areas of Africana philosophy, existentialism, phenomenology, social and political theory, post-colonial thought, theories of race and racism, philosophies of liberation, aesthetics, philosophy of education, and philosophy of religion. He has written extensively on Africana and Black existentialism, post-colonial phenomenology, race and racism, and on the works and thought of two of my favorite people in the world, W.E.B. Du Bois and Frantz Fanon. He is an academic, public intellectual, author, musician, and chef. He teaches at the University of Connecticut in the United States, where he is Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Global Affairs and head of the Philosophy Department. He lectures and is involved in political and artistic projects across the globe and holds appointments at universities and institutes in France, India, Jamaica, and South Africa. He is a world-renowned Frantz Fanon scholar, and he is born in Jamaica. Please help me welcome Professor Louis R. Gordon to the podium. Professor.
You didn't know that a podium could be a musical instrument, did you? It's not a very colonial rhythm, is it? Well, we're in Trinidad, so I'll give you. So Tau, Bashkoale, Chotep, Shalom, Assalamu alaikum, Vanikam, Sawbona, Domela, Melweni, and how you all keeping? There's so many ways. We're here in, I thought I would say hello first in Taino. We talk a lot about indigeneity, but sometimes it's a good idea, if we do this, even if it's with the greeting, to just say hello in the language of the ancestors of the land on which we stand. And one of our comrades was curious because he was shocked to see me in the hall with my shoes on. And I guarantee you my shoes are off. Some people often ask me, why do I speak without my shoes on? I actually don't eat also with my shoes on. And I don't teach with my shoes on. Now, it's a complicated story because many years ago, when I taught at Brown University, I teach open classes. I believe education's for the public. So when people would come through Providence, Rhode Island, they would come and just sit in my classes. There was a professor who came in and she sat in my class, and then she walked in and she said, "I heard something about you." And I was thinking, oh God, what did I do? And she said, "You teach without your shoes on." And I looked at her, and I looked down, and I was barefoot. Now, there are many explanations. One of them is, as you heard, I was born in Jamaica. So some people could say you could take the man out of the yard, but not the yard out of the man. Right? So, this, because it's, many of us here, especially in Jamaica, we run around barefoot when we're children. But there's another explanation. You see, I regard teaching, speaking, and also eating as sacred activity. And with sacred activity, you connect yourself to the ancestors. But by definition, if you have ancestors, there are those to come, descendants. In fact, our world becomes very dangerous if people abdicate the responsibility of becoming ancestors. Because at that moment, you throw away the future. And at that moment, you don't respect your elders and those who preceded you. That already tells you we're in a very dangerous moment, because there are people who are dominating the world today who have no regard for ancestors and none for descendants. That means such people think when they die, it is nothing short of the end of the world. What arrogance! This is one of the reasons why, with what we're going through right now, with the fascism and a lot of the other aspects of their behavior, the naked, rapacious capitalism we're seeing, it's very different than the past. Because, you see, there are people trying to reason with these people. But how do you reason with people who ultimately cannot see life beyond themselves? That is one of the challenges, you see? Now, I got to tell you, as I will get into things, some of the ways I said hello, because it's interesting, the Taino word Tao. Tao means good. And it's interesting, the ancient Kemetan word in the language of Meduneter, Hotep, it's often translated as peace, same as shalom and assalamu alaikum. But it's not peace the way people think of peace today. In fact, even the word shalom is from Shlomo. It means to make whole. And the idea is not whole like closed. The idea is that ultimately it's to wish health upon another, a healthy life, a good life. In fact, people are always talking about why are there so many wars. Well, it's because we're creating so many unhealthy societies. The inequalities, the dehumanization, all of that. If we don't fix that, of course people are going to always be going to war. So part of wishing on another health, the good life, to make whole, is to wish upon them something rather profound. It's to have a relationship with them in which people can continue to grow. Okay? Now, of course, if you say Sawubona, that's in isiZulu, that's a rather interesting one. That is, I see you. And and the response is, I see you too, and then you say Njani, which means, how are you? Isn't it profound that we human beings, when we meet one another, we greet one another? I mean, there's some people out there who want to make us think that the way human beings walk through the world is like this. What you looking at? They want to think we're creatures of war. That's not a greeting, that's a threat. We're fundamentally social creatures. And when we think about this, even though I began with this beat and went into the, we know we're all connected with a primordial beat, and you know the beat. One of humanity's greatest hits, your mother's heartbeat. There are people who'd like us to forget that beat, but that beat connects us. It's what reminds us that a human being is not a god. We're not born complete. We're not super powerful. What we are is connected to one another. And that mother's heartbeat puts you into a world with others' heartbeats. Because if your mother's heartbeat was, how are you going to communicate? In fact, there are times, you all notice, you're Trinidadians, and you know what carnival means to you, right? But this is an entire country in the beats, right? You know, when I was a child in Jamaica, one of the ways I would always hear about Trinidad, I'm going to say it, I'm going to say the name, was the mighty sparrow. Oh, yeah. Wasn't me. But the thing is, you know, and it's rather striking. The other ways I found myself linked here was in 2001 for the 100th birthday of C.L.R. James, when we came to the University of West Indies at St. Augustine. And then there are other ways in which there's a linkage here. For instance, not only C.L.R. James, but you know, I was the first president of the Caribbean Philosophical Association. And the association houses the C.L.R. James Journal. So it's not only, but in addition to that, there's the Claudia Jones Prize. Boy, you know, the island says a lot. You reach across the world, across history. But of course, we're here today to talk about Kwame Ture and Frantz Fanon. One of the things I'd like to say first about Kwame Ture is it's really striking about his name, you know, because his previous name, Stokely, you know, means like a tree stump out of which something grows. And Carmichael was the Scottish version of basically the fort of Michael. And Michael, is from Hebrew. And the name Michael, if you want to know why, also I know a lot of this Hebrew and various language stuff, is not only that I studied classics, but some of you may know I'm also Jewish. So, you know, we had to learn those names. Well, Michael means basically, who's like God? It's a way of saying no one is like God, but God can inspire. So the idea already in that name is something grows out of a stump, by which there can be the question, the rhetorical question of who is like God. And the idea is nobody's like God, and implicit in that is the statement of our humanity. It's a reminder that none of us is so powerful that we can be superior to everybody. But of course, there's Kwame Ture. And as many of you know, part of that is connected to his admiration to Kwame Nkrumah and to Sekou Toure. It's rather interesting because Kwame means born on Saturday, but Kwame Ture was born on Sunday. Of course, this shows the power of the transformation of symbols. Because Ture means elephant, right? Like a Saturday elephant, the strength of the elephant. And what many of you already know is that Kwame Ture was an admirer of El Malik al-Shabazz. And for those of you who don't know who El Malik al-Shabazz was, he was Malcolm X. And you already know that Kwame Ture was a great admirer of Frantz Victor Marguerite Fanon. A lot of people don't know it. They think his full name is Omar, but that's a complicated story. El Malik Al-Shabazz was born in 1925. Frantz Fanon was born in 1925. Patrice Lumumba was born in 1925. Medgar Evers was born in 1925. Man, boy, what kind of creative spirit was that, saying 1925? Good year to create some revolutionaries. I got to say, it's striking, by the way, being here in this community. There are quite a number of committed revolutionaries here. But you're revolutionaries in a beautiful, non-reductive way. Some of what I'm going to talk about are some of the dangers of what happens when the idea of revolution becomes reductive. If you look at this beautiful space, you could see the complexity of everything that references not only Ghana, the Asante Hina, but the names all the way through to Orishas, Yoruba, all the way through to the complexities of what the society is. It's really great. For instance, the Emancipation Support Committee, to whom I give thanks for this. Asha, thank you for your persistence. It's an understanding that when you say the word we is a very complex word to use. You see? Because if we try to use we in a way that says always not you, not others, you know, you're going to end up in a world eventually by yourself. And then eventually you're going to realize if you're completely by yourself, it's damn lonely. In fact, you won't be able to have the complexity of the relationships of that heartbeat. Now, I should also tell you, before I get into talking about Fanon, that I did meet Kwame Ture. He came to my undergraduate institution in the early 80s. And man, what an amazing, charismatic, brilliant speaker. It made a lot of us proud, not only as Caribbeans, but also I grew up in the Bronx where he grew up, you know, from his adolescent years onward. In the Bronx, he went to the Bronx High School of Science, as many of you know, and he went to Howard University, and man, what he did as an undergraduate. I mean, he lost track of how many times he got arrested. And when you look at all this crap going on in the United States right now, you realize how serious and courageous that was. Even the fact that when he was getting arrested, it was in places like Alabama, Mississippi. These are places in which, in a drop of a hat, they could kill you as a black person. But there he was. And then there was one time where he was being beaten, where his response was extraordinary. He began to sing. And a whole group of prisoners began to sing. And that is connected to, believe it or not, it's connected to black power in an unusual way, which I'm going to talk about. But the other thing, since I talked about his name, I should tell you a little about Fanon's name, because France means freedom. That's what France means. Okay? Marguerite means pearl. Victor, that's obvious. Victor, victory, right? Warrior name. But Fanon's a rather interesting name. There are a lot of debates about it. But Fanon is ultimately the name of the cloth used by the Pope. It's a cloth to represent fairness or injustice. So if you put Frantz Fanon's name together, he's a pearl who's a freedom fighter for justice. Isn't that wild? It's always funny how people get names and they realize their names. Because, you know, particularly people in the English language don't know the meaning of their names. Unless it's something like, you know, blacksmith or stone, you know. But it's really extraordinary, you know. And even some people with bad names realize their names. You know, the guy who ripped off people in Wall Street, his name was Madoff. Be careful how you name a child. The names are, you know. If you're curious, my name is a rather complex one. Louis means from Ludwig, Luther means warrior. And Ricardo is from Rex. Rex, people think of as king. But that's because when the Romans colonized Kemet, and the Greeks, the Macedonians, changed it into Egypt, they encountered a group of people who actually had the name Rex, not surname, but a community. They were called the Reket, Rex. And many of you may have not heard of this, but it's a specialized term for an ancient East African form of knowledge building related to decolonizing the mind. And one of the things about this community of knowledge builders, because in ancient Kemet, there are actually many words for knowledge and wisdom, a lot of them, but that's a whole other lecture. But the Reket, who practiced Rex, they were communities of women. They were women scientists. They were women who studied nature, law, and all of that. But the Romans, who were very patriarchal, weren't having any of that to know. For them, the lawgiver, the scientist, had to be in the masculine form. So the name, especially when associated with a head of state, became Rex. And over the years, we've inherited it that way. Which, not to be profane, but maybe it's apt then, when Rex became Richard, some of us began to call it Dick. But I'll avoid that. I'm rather proud that Ricardo is from Rex, from a community of extraordinarily gifted intellectuals who are women. And Gordon just means defender of the fort, which is rather striking because as much as I don't like or valorize violence, my entire life has been fighting and leading. And sometimes, again, you get the name because somehow the ancestors are calling you to a kind of action. So, we come to Monsieur Fanon. Now, the thing about it is, as I talk about Fanon, you're going to see a lot of it in terms of how he inspired Kwame Ture. But to talk about Fanon would be itself, I mean, I give whole seminars, lectures, stuff on Fanon. It would take up a lot of time, but many of you are already familiar with his life. Born 1925, Caribbean man, Martinique, right? Brilliant, absolutely brilliant, even as a child. Skipped grades through tricking the system by studying his older brother's books and walking into the exams and passing them. Right? Finally, they got sick of it when he was trying to do it the third time, and said, and because this was at the lycée, you got to do an oral exam, but they wouldn't let him sit for the oral exam. So then he just left the island, went to Dominica, trained, went off, and fought in the French Resistance, as you saw in the film. By the way, the films that we saw was a mixture of two films, Isaac Julian's film and Rico Spate's film, Rediscovering Fanon. Rico Spate film just came out, and I think you all should check it out. So a little shout out to Rico Spate. The thing that's true, when Fanon was going out to fight in World War II, one of the lycée professors said, "Yo, what you doing going for a white man's war?" And Fanon, classic Fanon, wherever there's injustice, where there's a strike against freedom, wherever there's dehumanization, I am there. So Fanon went off, and there were a series of indignities. Despite all of these Caribbeans volunteering to fight for France and for Britain and all of this, the black soldiers were put in the hull of the ship. And there were black women who volunteered to fight too, and they were treated with such indignities. They were told they had to sleep in the bedrooms of the officers, the white officers. They landed in North Africa, and they were like, "We're in the continent, the motherland, we're here." But a lot of North Africans looked at them and used the N-word. Then they went off and fought, and they were freeing everything from concentration camps to all kinds of villages. But in some of the villages, they would liberate, and this was extraordinary. The white women would, in some of them, ask for the German soldiers to be let out for the night for them to have white men to dance with, to celebrate their freedom. And then when these black soldiers were being sent back, they were sent back ahead of the white soldiers. They were sent back in hulls of ship with biscuit and water. Could you imagine? You're a former slave. You go to fight for freedom and you're coming back in the hull of a ship with biscuit and water. So when Fanon returned, that same lycée professor said, "So, you fought the war?" And Fanon said, "I fought a white man's war." Fanon, when he returned to Martinique, did some rather interesting things. One of them, he, as the film said, lobbied to get Aimé Césaire to be the mayor of Fort-de-France under the communist ticket. He also formed a football club with his brothers. And, you know, if you look at the football clubs then, since this is being streamed, for those who don't, the rest of the world call it football. The US, they call it soccer. So this team, a lot of the teams had colonial names, you know, like the Settlers team, the Golden this and that. But Fanon had a name for his team with his brothers. The team was Assault. You could imagine those games. Well, the Settlers Club, come on, but Assault is kicking there. And they were brutal. They were brutal. He did, after that, as you all know, go to France. He was a veteran, and he at first went to study dentistry. There's a lot, by the way, in the stories in between, but it's because of limited time I want to get into his thought. Because part of colonizing the mind is to think that black people only have biographies. We don't have ideas. So I'm going to talk about his ideas. But for some people, I thought they would like some context. He at first went to study dentistry, and I used to make a joke. The joke I used to make was, oh man, could you imagine if he had become a dentist? The kind of revolutionary jokes. You're getting to the root of the problem, you know? But I stopped making that joke. I was speaking in Nairobi one time. I was invited by Feroz Manji. And Feroz Manji, a stalwart, revolutionary, all kinds of things on the African continent. He's from Kenya, did all kinds of stuff in the UK. He's now in Canada. At the time in Nairobi, he was like, "What's wrong with a revolutionary dentist? I'm a dentist." And I was like, oh, my bad. But he left Paris and went to Lyon, where he studied philosophy, sociology, and psychiatry. There, he studied two kinds of psychiatry, forensic psychiatry, and he studied clinical psychiatry. Something about Fanon, some of you may not know, is that he grew up speaking Creole, or what we would call patois, but in the French form. So even though there are a lot of people who present him in a very petty bourgeois, high French way, he wasn't that way. One of the things, though, as you know, patois, Creole, is an Africanized language. And in African languages, and similar, because for instance, if you want to know the other, when I said Bashkuele, that was Mayan. In a lot of the indigenous American languages, in languages of Taino, for instance, as well, there's a metaphysics. And what that involves is you do not separate the person from the body. You see? There's a sense in which who you are is connected. There's a sense in which when I did that heartbeat thing, that connects us. So when Fanon was 14, he had witnessed an autopsy. He was disgusted by it, but it wasn't the gore. What disgusted him was the lack of dignity. He didn't like to see this woman's body probed and opened and all of that. For him, it was an assault on her personhood. And this tells you, at the age of 14 is when Fanon realized he was a humanist. For him, the idea of dehumanizing another was revolting. So you could imagine the idea that when he goes to study medicine, you have to do anatomy. When he was told he had to work on corpses, he couldn't do it, and then the professor told him, pretend it's a cat. So you could imagine when Fanon became a physician, and he went back to Martinique, why in the world did he take on the position of medical examiner? But when he did, and Fanon is always investigating, remember he's a forensic psychiatrist too, he would investigate certain cases, and he found a case where there was a woman who died under suspicious circumstances. He had her body exhumed. He conducted an autopsy and concluded she died from domestic violence. But nobody in the island would do anything about it. So Fanon left. He left for additional reasons. But this is crucial because, you see, one of the things when you talk about Fanon is that people immediately talk about violence. But they tend to talk about violence in a way that romanticizes military forms of violence. They don't realize how radical his anti-violence is. So the idea that he left connected to domestic violence is a very important thing to bear in mind, because there's a way in which there's a kind of hypermasculinity with the way people talk about someone like Fanon and many black revolutionaries, including Malcolm or El-Malik al-Shabazz. But these are stereotypic ways that fail to look at their profound capacity for empathy. These were men of love. And what they understood is that hate is about the effort to eradicate the other. It's about destruction, destroying others, no way of being connected. And many of you may know he went on to Saint-Alban, where he studied to be the head of a hospital, chef de service as they call it in France. He goes to Algeria. He transforms what was happening in Blidewanville Hospital there, and he gets caught up in the Algerian liberation struggle. The short version of his life is that there are all kinds of ways in which he helped that struggle. He eventually became an ambassador to Ghana, and near his death, he was trying to become a representative in Cuba. But the FLN, the Front Libération National, the National Liberation Front of Algeria, wouldn't let him do that. He discovered he had leukemia, which is rather interesting because, as you know, Kwame Ture, it was also cancer. And, yeah, in his case, prostate cancer, in this case, blood cancer. Could you imagine, by the way, to be someone who fights against racism and you have blood cancer? What that would mean. He ends up going to the Soviet Union for help. They said the best place was Bethesda, Maryland, right? The CDC, literally, the research medical center that now the Trump administration is trying to shut down. Fanon at first said, why do I have to go to a nation of lynchers? But what he meant by that is his wife, Joseph de Blay, was Roma and Corsican. Now, there she's not white, but in the US, she's white. So this would be an interracial couple going to the South, Maryland, for his convalescence. However, he contracted pneumonia as a consequence of it and died on December 6th, 1961 at 5:30 p.m. So that's just a little about his life. But now the ideas. Well, the first thing to bear in mind is that there are several themes from Fanon that connect all the way through to Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Thank you for mentioning him. Ngugi wa Thiong'o was basically a relative, okay? He was a beautiful person. And a lot of the issues he talks about is connected here. The thing about it is that Fanon, when he was a medical student, had written a thesis that he was going to submit to his professors. But his professors were psychophysiologists. The thesis was called Sur la désaliénation de Noir, on the disalienation of the black. But when the professors saw it, they were like, nah, we don't want that. 2 weeks later, he submitted another thesis on Friedreich's ataxia, which is a degenerative disease. But the basic thing, he knew they were going to reject it. But he did that for a reason. Because you see, Fanon noticed something very peculiar. When he was a medical intern, he noticed that there were some people who would come to him. Dr. Fanon, well, he wasn't a doctor yet, but You know, physician Fanon, I have a problem. What's the problem? I have a problem. Police follow me everywhere. They call me the N-word everywhere. I'm constantly being degraded. I'm paid less, I'm spat on, I'm treated bad. And Fanon began to notice something very peculiar. Ask yourselves a question. If you are treated that way, and you don't say there's something wrong, that would be weird. In fact, what Fanon noticed was something rather strange, which is that, you see, the purpose of psychiatry is to make a person at home with his, her, or their environment, is to reacclimate them. But what in the world would that mean, to reacclimate, to make a person well-adjusted to racism, colonialism, sexism? Do you see what I'm saying? Fanon made two observations. The first one is, they're pissed off because they're healthy. If any of you become the happy slave, that is profoundly unhealthy. In fact, I mentioned sometimes, you know, in old psychiatry books in the United States, there was a disease called drapetomania. Any of you all ever heard of drapetomania? Yeah, it's the disease that an enslaved person has of desiring freedom. Meditate on that. So what Fanon realizes, if they're healthy, the cure in medical terms would be to make them unhealthy. So Fanon had a different answer, and this is the underlying thesis that connects him to the community here, to Kwame, Ture, and that is, they needed to become actional. They need to go out and try to change the social conditions that degrade them. That is what they need to do. They need to become political. So Fanon wrote Sur la désaliénation de Noirs, connected to that thesis. But his brother, Joby, and that was the brother with whom he was very close, said, wait a minute. When he read the book, he said, you know, this book is really about on the disalienation of the black and the white. Now, you may wonder why he said this, and I'll explain briefly, and then we'll continue from there. When Fanon took the book to Francis Janson, a protege of Jean-Paul Sartre, Janson loved the book, invited Fanon over back then, that you meet with the publisher. Fanon walked into the room. Janson said, I love the book, come on, sit down. And Fanon said, you mean it's not bad for a book written by a N, no? And Janson looked at him and was very upset, walked and opened the door and said, get out of my office. And Fanon smiled. He said, I can work with you. He refused to be patronized. You see, there are people who would want to exoticize black people, patronize us, treat us like children with our thought, and Fanon would have none of that. So the two developed a friendship for life. And what Janson said, I love the book, but I don't like the title. How about Peau Noire Masque Blanc? Black skin, white mask. And Fanon said, you know, that's what my brother was saying. So here's the thing. Most people who read that book mistakenly think the book is about black people wearing white masks. It is not. The book is about two fundamental lies of colonialism, specifically Euro-modern colonialism. The first lie is the lie of that black skin equals non-human. In other words, negative blackness. You know, most of the history of humankind, people didn't look at black as negative. If you look at a lot of, in fact, the quintessential image of death in a lot of, not only Africa, but a lot of other parts of the world was whiteness. Okay? But what colonialism did was to construct blackness as negative. And the idea is that as negative, you're less than human. That's the lie. You see? But it also constructed another lie. It constructed the lie of whiteness. Whiteness in that lie is superior, is above human. That lie is the white mask. It's the mask that people who are called white are told to wear. Okay? And although many people who are white know the truth, which is deep down, they're simply human beings. They eat, sleep, and defecate like everybody else. And when they defecate, to my knowledge, because many of us are also from extended family or white, it doesn't smell like roses. So the idea of perfection, white is right. If you're born white, it's right. That's the lie. And what Fanon said was rather profound, that if you construct a group of people above human and a group of people below human, where are human beings? Where are human beings? And Fanon described that as the attempted murder of humanity. Yeah. He says basically colonialism kills humanity. So this already tells you something very crucial in Fanon, right? That child, that 14-year-old who became a humanist, kept that into his medical experience, kept that through war. But this very idea then, that's what you got to fight against, these lies. How do you do it? Now, it's easier to talk about this because, you see, there are a lot of people in this room who are revolutionaries, and there's a concept that many of you are familiar with. It's called dialectics. But not dialectics in the stereotype sense. Okay? It's in a different sense. You see, the stereotypic dialectics basically tells you that you resolve contradictions, create something new, and that something new is to become the whitest of the white. Almost every abstract term that's used is some version of becoming a European before you can be a revolutionary. But what Fanon and many others, from Antoine Firmin in Haiti, all the way through to C.L.R. James understood, is that here is the problem. You know when I say white mask, black skin, they're constructed as opposites. So that means one treats itself as a universal positive and the other as a universal negative. That requires apartheid, separateness. That's why all colonialisms push for apartheid, separateness. But remember when I did that thing about the heartbeat? Humanity is connectedness, interaction. But it's impossible to interact with another human being without being affected. In other words, even though a lot of us have a stereotypic view of colonization where we think the colonizer comes in and crushes out everything in the colonized, that's not historically correct. Because the colonized are human beings who resist, who fight, and in many ways will offer ways that transforms and in fact is one of the reasons for the survival of some of the colonizers. So what happens is that the contradiction comes in. A contradiction is to show a false universal. The contradiction of the white mask is humanity. The contradiction of the lie about black people being below human beings is black people's humanity. And this is one of the reasons why people like Fanon, like C.L.R. James, and many others in the global south are able to articulate the Haitian Revolution as a revolution. They're able to articulate this because, you see, when you find a contradiction, it means you face an existential question. And the existential question, I mean, I don't have to get fancy. I like the way Jim Brown does it. The existential question is, what you gonna do? You know, we could get fancy. I could give you all kinds of theoretical stuff. I could talk with you with all kinds of ciscorpodalia through which I'm an energumen, which what I said is big words through which I'm a big user of big words. But ultimately, a lot of life, you all notice, everybody notice, that being a human being is when you come out of your mother's womb. Life is what you're going to do. And this is a crucial question that Fanon examines. Because you see, once we look at the contradictions, it doesn't follow you know the outcome before the act. Whenever you see something that's false, the quest for truth is ongoing. If you thought this theater was the world and somebody opened the room and said, "What go on in here?" Now you know there's an outside, but you don't know if when you go out that door, whether you're going to fall, go forward, go sideways, or up. You don't know. You have to step out the room. And this is the crucial element that Fanon began to understand. In a lot of Fanon's writing, there's an organic relationship between action and knowledge. For Fanon, the idea of a completely abstracted away way of looking at the world doesn't work. So this question, what you got to do, leads ultimately to some of the themes that you're going to see later in Le Damné de la Terre, the damned of the earth, which many of you know is the wretched of the earth. I don't like that translation, because I don't think we're wretched. Think about when you think of somebody as wretched. You see? But if you understand it, you can be right, you can be good, but you can be damned, condemned. And we know that there have been a lot of examples of condemned innocence. So the question comes in, what are we going to do? Now, one of the things Fanon identified then is that colonialism is not simply about guns and all of that stuff, because you see, if you rely on violence, you're going to have to use up all your resources. The question was just brought up when Asha was giving the introduction about, for instance, Gaza. Look at the resources. You know, it's amazing that right now you're looking at not only, there's a big difference between Israel and the US, believe it or not. A lot of people see them as one. But in the US, there's a preference for even $1 billion being spent on weapons than on schools or on healthcare. They're spending a lot of money on decimating. Ultimately, and it's pretty clear that the Likud party there, that their project from the moment they saw October 7th was not to see it as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. And it's an opportunity that's very clear right now. We know it because we know that Trump sees Gaza, the West Bank, it sees Palestine as real estate. That's classic dehumanization. They don't see it as a place with people, but dehumanization. And it's clear the Likud party sees it as an opportunity for de facto genocide. You know, people were talking about genocide before the actual bombing began. So they weren't acting empirically. There was an opportunity to do something different. But it's pretty clear that the project there is the wiping out of the people. But here's the tricky part, and this is why understanding this aspect of Fanon is important. Because you see, when I said the white mass and the black skin, Fanon shows these false dilemmas in all of his writings. And one of them is also in the way we use the notion of the right and the left. Because you see, although some people may call themselves left, they may be historically associated with the left, their actions may not be left. The thing about the right is that right-wingism has very clear objectives, you see? And I'll just briefly give you a sense of what I mean by this. There's no such thing as living as human beings without crisis. And crisis means you have to make a decision. Some people in crisis want to avoid crisis by going back to what they imagine was a perfect time. In other words, they want to go back to being children. The right wing then looks for order. It wants to eliminate differences. And eventually, it pushes itself to the extreme where the objective becomes being one, only one. And you know the problem with that? When you want to just become homogeneous, only one. Could you imagine if Trinidad tried to eradicate any difference? After a while, there's just one kind of person left. And you know what the problem that person is going to have? Looking in the mirror. The moment you look in a mirror, you notice you're not exactly the way you thought you were. So you're going to have to get rid of yourself. But you see, the historic left was premised upon a certain set of values. One of them already articulated Fanon, humanism, to be right. Other one's equality. Another one is dignity. Another one is small r republicanism. Small r republicanism means no one is above the law. No one is above law. There are other elements as well. Joy, flourishing, growth. However, when you fetishize a one shoe size that fits all, even if you have a left identity, if your position is to close off equality, close off the possibility of growth, in your actions, close off, you may call yourself left, but you're really right wing. Fanon and there are others began to identify the problem of paradoxically a right wing left. And why I bring this up is because, you see, many of you who look at somewhere like the Middle East right now, can any of you name any country in the Middle East that's not right wing? Yemen? Given the definition I just gave, it's right wing. If you look across North Africa, East Africa, the expansion of the Middle East is to wipe out black presence and to create a singularity. Why this is tricky is because Fanon was willing to go there in his critique. Because sometimes we are facing right wings, fighting right wings. And we have to ask ourselves a serious question. Okay? What are we not paying attention to in the struggles we build, which is what Le Dernier de la Terre was about? Because you see, in Le Dernier de la Terre, he opened up first with violence. And think about it, when you say Fanon, if you walk around, I got my Fanon, there are people going to be like, yo man, are you down with violence? Now, there are people who respond to that in a certain way but they're hypocritical. And Fanon is right about it, they're hypocritical. Because you know how much white violence has transpired in the last 500 years. There are a lot of things we're always worried about, but every time there's been an access to extraordinary power, who has acted on that in extraordinarily genocidal forms? Whether it's in Hiroshima, whether it's in Nagasaki, whether we looked at all kinds of activities that were happening where we stand. There's a reason this room isn't majority people, indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. Yet, the lie of the white mass makes people imagine they're safer in the world if it's run by people who are white. Okay? But here's the thing. The moment you mention the question of violence and it's coming out of brown and black, it's an outrage, it's a scandal. Because, and this is connected to something Fanon talked about earlier. He talked about it in Black Skin, White Mask. You know, when a lot of us talk about racism, we talk about the self and the other, right? You academics may hear people say, I don't want to be the other. I don't want to be othered. You know what Fanon said to that? When you're an other, at least you're another human being. Self-other is ethical. But what racism is about is to construct a world where there are selves, others, and people who are not selves and not others. Think about this. What happens when you're not even an other? You know, when that happens, almost anything can be done to you without accountability. What we're looking at happening in many parts of the world today, including the Sudan, are people who are being put into a category of non-others. They're people who sleep perfectly fine, despite even their greater casualties in the Sudan. There is a genocide going on in the Sudan, but even the UN says it well. People aren't really listening because those are black people. The category of making black people below, in other words, not even another, means anything can be done to us. So the idea of black people appearing violates the space of ethics. And that's why there's a tendency to look at when we say, I exist, I am human, I am here, the response is to say, you scare me, you're violent. So Fanon was saying this. Ironically, a lot of people don't realize this, Fanon was anti-violence. But here's his point. If you don't do anything about violence, you're complicit with violence. You have to do something. But you have to take seriously that if you interfere, you are going to be called violent. And Fanon said it's better to interfere and be called violent than to stand on the side and do nothing. So what Fanon argued was this. If you're going to interfere, it has to be to construct a society that eradicates the conditions that foster violence. In other words, if you're truly anti-violence, you build a better, healthy, just society. And that project, then, is what separates him from the groups who see the interference not as an interference to stop violence, but simply to perpetuate a violence that's premised on whose side are you on. It's a violence premised upon misanthropy, the elimination of the other. And when I talk about this question of elimination of the other, you got to look at it this way. Do any of you know of any human community that's without conflict? Or let me put it in a different way. Any of you who are in relationships, is there any marriage without conflict? No. But here's the difference. When you're committed to the marriage, the conflict strengthens the marriage. When you're not committed to the marriage, the conflict constructs your partner as an enemy. And in that conflict, you're in war. And this is a thing people don't understand about war. War is about the elimination of the other. It's not about whether you're right or wrong. It's about whether you win. And here's the problem with that. Everyone in this room can name an example of people who win wars who are wrong. Winning doesn't make you right. So Fanon wanted to create an understanding of what it is to win a war and what would make it right. And what would make it right is the commitment to building a society that uplifts the value of human beings. Okay? So that's why Fanon actually argued that it's a waste of time to show you're nonviolent. He says you need to do what must be done to build a better world, a better society. So this is where we're going to come to the relevance to the Caribbean today and Kwame Ture. Because throughout Fanon's writing, there's a sub-theme. And that sub-theme is power. Power. You know, it's a very strange period right now because, I mean, I was born in the 60s. You know, I remember hearing black power, power. And suddenly by the time the postmodern 90s come, people are like arguing against power. People are like, I don't like that power. Power corrupts, power, power, power. You know, a lot of people when they talk against power, You notice they rarely ever define what power is? So let me give a definition of power, and let me know if it resonates with you. Okay? Because part of decolonizing the mind is to understand the concepts. Okay? And we already know that colonialism works better, not simply by using the violence, but by convincing you that the black skin really is inferior. Is by if you can be convinced, if all the ways you rally forth knowledge is to support your inferiority, then you don't need police, you don't need soldiers, because you police yourself. You dominate yourself. You make yourself inferior. You always say, we can't, we can't, we can't, we can't. Why not? Well, one of them is to make us hate power. Okay? Well, here's what power is. Power is the ability to make things happen with access to the conditions of doing so. The absolute example of power we can imagine is God. Could you imagine if God said, Louis, shut up, walks on the stage, and you're like, who are you? And the answer is, now here's an example of colonization. Most people expect God to say, I am God. Right? Very patriarchal, male-centered. But why can't God pop up and say, I'm God? Or why can't God show up gently in her, his, or their form? Just I'm here. First thing everyone in this room would say if God, her mighty, his mighty, or almighty popped up, you know what you're all going to say? You God? God says, damn straight. The first thing everybody in this room would say, do something. And if God says, I can't, you're going to say, what kind of God are you? What kind of God can't do anything? So already implicit right there is a crucial element of God. In fact, one of the words for power is potency. God is supposed to be omnipotent, right? Right? All-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing. Power and knowledge are related. But here's the interesting thing. It's part also of colonization of the mind. If we stop with talking about power through the etymology of the word impotent, because that's Latin. That's like, you notice something happened when I talked to you about the name Rex? Already, many of you are like, I didn't know that. I was African, an African woman. Well, the word potent is the Latin word, but it actually has a greater origin in the ancient Medu-Neter East African words, pathe. And pathe is a rather interesting word, because to have pathe, which is also linked to the way you have titles like pharaohs and those, to have pathe, you had to have a thing called heka. And heka points to the womb. It points to life. The argument is, it doesn't matter how many abilities you may have, unless you have access to the conditions to make those abilities work, there's no power. And this is the crucial part. Because you see, conditions such as education, language, words, conditions such as how we build buildings like this, everything like that's a condition. And those conditions enable you to do something. You ever meet people who people always say they're smart, but they never realize it? It doesn't matter how smart you may seem, without the conditions of a community to realize your potential, nothing happens. And this is one of the crucial things, because you see, even if we think about something like the slave trade, the enslavement of people, one of the big historical lies is that the people who are enslaved were just walking in the bush and snatched. But enslaved Africans were part of complex societies. The people who were being enslaved and snatched away were everything from physicians to architects, and this is not, you could look it up yourself. They had work in agronomy. This is the reason why plantations that had people directly from Africa had the knowledge from Africa, because a lot of the conditions in the Americas were very hostile for what they wanted on the plantations. Once we understand that this was not just enslaved labor, this is enslaved knowledge. And with it, all the abilities, they became the conditions of possibility of the wealth of this region, and as Fanon said, the entire globe. Those people, in other words, had powers in the plural. The indigenous peoples who are here, powers in the plural. So once we understand this, now we understand that part of oppression was to limit the conditions that the people had access to. You see? Every one of us right now, for instance, we are in our body. But because we have speech, we can communicate with somebody beyond our body. Because this is live stream, there are people I don't even know that I'm reaching. That is power. When you have power, you reach outward. But if someone cut the feed, I'm not reaching those people anymore. If something suddenly made you all both unable to hear and unable to see, sounds are coming out of my mouth, but I'm not communicating. And that means that eventually I'm in my body. This is why imprisonment is an example of dehumanization. And then eventually, if I can't even move my body, where am I to go but in my mind? And if there is affected, I implode. So you already see this, that racism, colonialism, all of those are exemplifications of disempowerment. How do you fight disempowerment without getting empowered? This was Fanon's point. You see, bad power hoards the conditions and make them available to the few. That's what capitalism does. You see? That's what's going on right now. You see, not only the United States, but quite a few other countries. But if you expand and share the conditions, then people have health, clean water, food, education, etc., they're able to expand how they can affect the world. So this means then that the very idea of trying to build power is a crucial element of liberation. But a world that says black people must be disempowered, then black and power together is, oh my God. That's illicit. You don't want that. So the insight, not only from Richard Wright in 1954, who said black power, but you could also find this in Anna Julia Cooper in the 1890s. You could also, you already know, you could find it in, subsequently in Angela Davis, you find it in Kwame Ture. And he was inspired by Fanon because Fanon was basically saying that ultimately you must act through building the conditions for your liberation and then your freedom. So I'm going to conclude with the relevancies. One of the first and obvious relevant point that you get is the point I just made about power. A crucial issue in the Caribbean is that we have to build the conditions that can actually empower the people. The question is going to be how you're going to do that. Well, to understand this, you need to understand an important nuance. In Fanon's writing, once he talked about violence, he also had a critique of a lot of the people who were engaged in the national liberation struggle. And that's because Fanon knew the distinction between liberation and freedom. Liberation is a necessary condition, but you don't stop at liberation. Because all liberation is the unshackling. A lot of people thought they were free when enslavement was declared illegal. Then a lot of people thought they were free when they had national independence. But no, all that is a beginning. The thing you have to do now is build freedom. But what is freedom? Well, freedom, as Fanon understood it, was profoundly existential and relational. Freedom is about building a livable world. It's about, in fact, the word freedom, its origins is in the word friend. It means, and when you think about it, friend is a relationship. It's about building a world in which you can have the kind of meanings that you could live by. This is crucial because you see, what's meaningful for one generation, that's what he meant by it, is not necessarily meaningful for the next generation. And the problem Fanon saw was that the people who were trying to build the liberation were still locked, they were still colonized in the conceptions of meaning that were wedded to the colonial period. If you look at almost every post-colony, the moment they're no longer a colony, they connect with the rest of the world. They become creative, they use all kind of language, they have different foods. If you go all over the African continent, there's African hip-hop, African jazz, African samba. You look all over the Caribbean, we know our Caribbean music go everywhere, global. All in the arts, when we look at all the other levels, great. But where you don't see decolonization is in the institutions of power. You go all over the world, whether it's Asia, Australasia, South America, the Caribbean. Well, if you look at what are the institutions of power? The economy, the government system, how you organize, whether it's you call it parliament, senate, whatever you call it. The religions, those are institutions of power. The educational systems, institutions of power. Okay? And what Fanon noticed, and not only those, another institution of power, believe it or not, and he brings it up, is architecture. The way we arrange cities, right? What would fit living in the Caribbean and fit living in equatorial Africa is very different. In fact, you know, I love our fellow Kuti, his song Gentleman. You ever heard that one? Yeah. The idea that you're going to live in a hot zone, you see, I'm wearing a wonderful Senegalese suit. And by the way, this was developed in the Caribbean. It wasn't developed in Africa. And then Africans said, why are we wearing wool suits with ties and hats and wool stuff in the heat? So you have to develop what fits. But a lot of the post-colonial states, although they liberated the nation, their weddedness to meaning, organizations of meaning from the past was shackling the nation at the level of meaning. The other generations, Fanon argued, need to have access to meaning. They need to transform the institution, get creative ways. And by the way, this is not to say they're not doing it, because I have to tell you, I was in Tobago at the end of March. And Trinidad has a fine tradition of brilliant intellectuals who understand what it is to look forward. A good example, and thank you for your support. I'm talking about, you know, our esteemed colleague, principal from St. Augustine, a son of Trinidad, Stefan Alexander, a physicist, saxophonist, and much more. He drew upon his proud Trini identity and goes and connects it to his African and his East Indian identity. And he organized 60 of the world's top scientists here to come to Trinidad and Tobago to rethink the meaning of science and what it is to have science in the global South. That is a generation taking on their mission. And there are many other examples of this. We do it as musicians, we should do it as economists more, but we also should understand building new science. That is a condition of using our abilities for empowerment. So with that one, Fanon was clearly not only endorsing the question of power, but the question of black power is the idea of creating flourishing and growth. Now, there are others that we could think about. Clearly, the obvious one that has to be put on the table is that Fanon, and this is hard for many people, he was anti-nation state. Fanon took the position that humanity has outgrown the nation state, but like that other example, we're clinging to an organization of power that was designed for a different world. You see, nation states have inside, outside. You know, when I landed, for instance, in Trinidad, in Port of Spain this morning, the immigration person did not only want to know if I had good papers, but she wanted me to have the exact flight number in which I would get the hell out. That's nation state. Nation states produce vulnerability, refugees. It creates, right? Think about it. When labor is very poor, it wants to go where opportunities are. But if you have nation states, you're going to have vulnerable people to be taken advantage of. The other thing about nation states, why we've outgrown it, is because we don't live on the same planet as our ancestors. Now, you may say that sounds weird. But what I mean by that is that earliest human beings, humans have been around 2 million years. The ones close to us, 1 million years. Ones who are a lot even closer, about 700,000 years. We have only been around a short 300,000 years. But one of the things that we have to think about is those ancestors lived on a big planet. But those ancestors emerged in technologies. They had technologies from access to language to all kinds of things. But even with those technologies, they first had to use foot. So the planet was very big. Then they found a way to make some canoes and boats. The planet began to get a little smaller. Then they found a way to create roads to make you move now faster. The planet got smaller. And every time we had a development, the planet got smaller and smaller. Now we live on a planet where we could communicate with one another in a nanosecond, and everyone in this room with modest means can get to the other side of the planet within 24 hours. Man, in my lifetime, in most of your lifetime, think about what a letter was. You mail it, you wait a couple of weeks, and that was fast. And then you get it back, and you could have a correspondence over a year of maybe 5 letters. But then you have, and even with the landline, remember, international calling, you had to wait. But now, no. Everybody, planet is smaller. We have 8 billion people. Planet is smaller. But you know what has not changed as the planet got smaller? A lot of our values. A lot of the way we organize political institutions. We have not decolonized them. In fact, we're trying to force on a world that's so different a set of values, a set of political orders for a big planet. But if we didn't have nation states, everybody on the planet, and mind you, I'm not saying get rid of nations, but nation states, the meeting of the nation and the state, produces vulnerable people. If we didn't have that, if labor doesn't like it at one place, it just goes to another. So that means if you want to retain labor, you know what you got to do? Uplift the life conditions of labor. You got to empower them. If there's any kind of a thing that is dehumanizing people, you can have a different arrangement of power in the globe. So in other words, Fanon was being visionary. In fact, when Fanon died, he was struggling with Patrice Lumumba died before him, to create a United States of Africa. Because he realized that North Africa had a very different project. It wasn't an African project, it was the expansion of a Middle Eastern project and a continued domination of Africans. He wanted the North Africans to identify as Africans across the whole continent and create a situation of mobility and power and conditions that a very, very rich continent at the level of minerals and resources could have the people's ownership over the whole continent. Well, that's a message for the Caribbean, isn't it? Because the Caribbean has a lot of us right now who, in order to even visit one another, we have to stop off in the United States. Talking about continued colonization, right? There are all kinds of ways in which there are people, there's some people they don't care if their little rock is 12 miles. They want it to be separate and have their little place. Fine. But the fact of the matter is, we on our planet right now can't do anything, not only about the question of our dehumanization and our degradation, but also the planet itself. How are we going to handle the environmental crisis when it just takes a few nation states to say, I'm not in? And last I hear, pollution in the air goes everywhere. Okay? There's something unique about the Caribbean that comes in here because we are dealing directly with these conditions at the marine biological level, at the spatial level. We're dealing with many levels, the economic level, all the way through. So this is where the great ending of Le Dernier de la Terre comes in. Because you see, the mistake we all make is when we try to become imitations. What we need to do, he said, is build new concepts. That's what Stefan Alexander et al. Are doing. We need to set afoot a new way of thinking ourselves as human beings. And with that, he brings forth the very important question. And that's the one I'm going to close with. And this is something that mattered to Kwame Ture, mattered to El Malik Al-Shabazz, to Claudia Jones. It mattered all the way through, but I'm going to bring it up through Fanon, but through Anna Julia Cooper. She has a wonderful essay called, What Are We Worth? What are we worth? You see, that question when you're born, what you're going to do, is really saying what in what you're doing exemplifies what you're worth. And what that means is another way of saying dignity. You see, every one of you in this room, if you're just simply looking to knock somebody down, that's easy. But if you're looking to build a better world, that has within it the question of value that transcends you. That is dignity. Dignity is when you begin to understand the profound radical force of love. See, hate is easy. Burn it down, tear it down. Okay, fine, then everybody's homeless. But building homes, livable homes, where people come in as valued, where people come in as human beings who are treasured, where people learn to respect their environment, where people understand that it's not about us today. It's about understanding how we are the conditions of possibility for those to come. It's the extraordinary selflessness of the people I've been talking about. The fact that they had no reason to know any of us who are in this room right now. Even on this island, there was a time where this room right now would just be males. It's because of the struggles, the fights that many people did that make us in a very ordinary way live something that for them was extraordinary. So at the heart of revolution is the radicality of love. At the heart of revolution is the courage and the commitment to build the extraordinary in such a way that future generations can live it in their own ways, which would be ordinary for them. And what love would that be indeed? Because if you do it right, you know what those generations would really say. They would say like what we are saying to Kwame Ture, to Frantz Fanon, to El Malik Al-Shabazz, to Patrice Lumumba, to Claudia Jones, to Anna Julia Cooper, Harriet Jacobs, the list is very long, Mary Seacole, all of them, we could just keep going. What we're really doing, if we set such conditions for the future, is to enable the subsequent generations to say those beautiful words. Thank you. Thank you.
Testing. All right. Thank you, brother. Thank you, brother. Kwame Ture used to say that the greatest crime one can commit in Africa is to be ungrateful. Brothers and sisters, let us put our hands together and thank our brother for this presentation. And let us acknowledge that if we think carefully about what has been said today, this lecture is truly a radical lecture. in the best tradition of that term. Thank you, brother. And now, brother, I'm going to ask you, as I'm sure you're aware, to grace us with your presence, to stay at the microphone, because we are going to open the floor to questions. And I'm going to, as I move across the floor to my brother there, I'm going to quote Fanon. Our esteemed professor talked about him and the question of mimicry. Oh, we have a question here. Okay, but I'm going to.
Well, can I add to that too? It's good for us to learn from one another and with one another. So if there are many questions, I have a very unique ability. I can answer as many questions as posed. So it'd be good, that way everybody who has a question get to ask their question.
Well, we're going to try. Should we take 3 questions and then?
Whichever is good.
And then you can answer. So we take 3 questions from the floor, and then we'll answer them, and then we'll go back for 3. But just a quick quote, the way that France put that question of mimicry in his own words was he said, history is waiting for something from us, the native people, the formerly colonized, other than the nauseating mimicry of Europe, what he called an obscene caricature, to advance humanity one step further. He was truly a poet in the way that he said things himself. Brother, your question.
Yes. Hi, Ryan Hamilton Davis from the Trinidad Newsday. Really interesting lecture. One of the things I wanted to zoom in on was your identification of, let me see if I can put it in my own words, understanding that in order for us to be free, we have to be unshackled from the certain things that we mimic in the colonial state. If that's the best, I think that's the best way I could say it off the top of my head. And one of the things that I noticed that you spoke of, particularly with the laws and the systems of laws that we have, was that while we have different cultures, we could look around now, we could see East Indian, we could see Asian, we could see various levels of Asian culture, but our legal system, our political system is still based off of the colonial rubric, which is the Westminster system. All right? Now, why I think what you said was really radical was that in order for us to unshackle ourselves from that whole set of colonialism, would that not mean that we may have to step away from the current operations of the Westminster system, people standing up in the Red House, having a left and a right, having these systems in play? How do we deal with that while having something so ingrained?
Right, thank you. I think you got that one, brother. Yes? Let's get 2 more quickly. And quickly, while we do this, brothers and sisters, let me recognize Sister Roxanne Mohammed. Let's give her a round of applause. The Kwame Ture Center in Laventille is a very important institution, and we have one of the directors here. Brother.
Good evening. My name is David Springer. I'm a bilingual psychotherapist, and one of the things I'm interested in is actually Fanon's thoughts on psychotherapy. But not only that, I'm thinking about, you just spawned so many thoughts in my mind. I'm thinking about intergenerational trauma and how it actually affects us here in the Caribbean. I would like to hear what you have to say about reimagining the concepts related to how we view the mind and also the decolonization of that space of healing the mind. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's 2 heavy questions. Let me give these to the brother first, so we don't get too many in the bag, and then we come back and take some more. I know, we're taking your own. We're taking your own for sure.
I can if you want a third. That's fine.
Okay, you want to go for a third? Let's go for a third right away. All right.
Yeah, my name is Gavin Stewart. I'm a writer. I want to ask, how do you describe what is happening in South Africa? Okay? Vis-a-vis the dismantling of political apartheid, but it seems, according to Julius Malema, economic apartheid is still untouched. Okay? All right, how do you deal with that one? And,
okay.
I want to ask, yeah, just now, just now.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, well, it's a lot of things, but I want to encapsulate it in a short way. All right, because he want to ask about Gaza, so go ahead.
No.
Yeah, brother, I'm just giving everybody a cue here now, all the questioners. We really welcome your contributions, but we have to keep everything very, very brief because we're pressed for time. We have a certain time to be out of here, and we still have other artists to performance on. But we're going to try to get in as many questions as possible. Over to you, brother, Professor.
Okay, I'm going to deal with the first and the third and then go to the second, okay?
Okay, sure.
Because they're connected. As you know, among the list of Caribbean luminaries I could have mentioned was Audre Lorde. And Audre Lorde is very famous for saying the master's tool cannot tear down the master's house. Never did, never will. But she didn't answer the second part. And I was actually raising the second part in my talk. Because you see, masters don't build houses. And if you ever see a master build a house, the tools that build a lot of those houses, a lot of even the conceptual tools, and you know, as a scholar, I could go through a lot of stuff in the ancient world all the way through. It was built by the rest of the world, but a lot of it in Africa, okay? Now, why this is very important is that part of the argument is that if you build other houses, you take the concept of mastery out of that particular house. After a while, it's just a house, you see? But if you don't realize your capacity, your power, your ability to build houses, then if you burn down his house, you sit there blindly and think you don't know what to do. So it's very important to draw upon the understanding and the creativity and the resources, the tools we have. And we have quite a number of them. If you look at how the first and the third question are connected, the basic premise, the problem of mimicry comes straightforward. There's something that I didn't talk about, but I talk about a lot in my writings, which is that Euromodern colonialism generated a set of questions. One of them is, what is to be a human being? I talked a little about that. What does it mean to be liberated and what does it mean to be free? That's a lot of what we're talking about. The third is how we deal with the question of justification. Because a lot of knowledge, a lot of arts was used to rationalize our inferiority. But we're asked as intellectuals to use arts and knowledge for our liberation. We can't do that without being properly critical of how we do it. The others connect to notions of redemption, dignity, etc. But why this is important is this. If you look at the first one, if someone says, you're not a human being, and you say, what are you talking about? I'm a human being, I'm just as human as you are, you would have lost the argument. Because you would have made the person who challenged your humanity stand as the standard. And if you make the racist, sexist, homophobic, all the long list of stuff, the standard, then all you're going to do in your mimicry is to repeat. You're just replacing the players, but you're not changing the game. Revolution is about changing the game. To change the game requires having a different understanding of who and what we are. The reason I talked about, for instance, a Patois Creole and African and South Asian and indigenous, and I don't mean to romanticize them, because in Europe they used to think that way. You see, a lot of the way we think of humanity today was hijacked by a group of psychopaths, okay? And I really mean it, I'm not saying it allegorically. A psychopath is a person who lacks empathy. A psychopath is a person who could only see people, other life forms, as instruments. If you think about it, if we think about a concept like markets, just to give an example, humanity has always had markets, but markets were very human. When we had markets, even today, if you go to Tunapuna Market, there are people who, I've been there and had it, it's great. Anyway, if you go, you don't just go there to buy something. You go there to socialize. You catch up on news. When people created malls, it was an idea to deal, right, to make people just shop, but most people go to malls to socialize. The ancient forms that continued to this day of human socializing was through the plurality of markets. They were very human. But the psychopaths popped up and said, no, the problem with markets is they're too human. Let's make markets focus on efficiency and production and profit. You notice no human being in there. In fact, if you look at what's happening right now, Elon Musk's wet dream is to have a world of service, production, and profit without people. That's the project. We know it. But here's the thing. That's because they cannot understand the sociality of markets. And this is what's crucial. You see, the mimicry part, right, would treat capitalism as if it's a god. Capitalism is the effort to push away markets and have a singularity called the market. You ever notice I say the market? And if you look at the way the market is talked about, it's talked about like a god. It's the same argument you have about God. The market will make the decision. The market will know. No, it won't. Because the market fundamentally is premised on the elimination of human beings. So the mimicry part would be is the failure to understand that where you have the human relations, there's creativity. One of the wonderful books Fanon wrote was Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution, in which he pointed out the participation, the active participation in trying to construct a society brings out people's creativity. There are so many ways. I can't imagine, for instance, real creativity in Trinidad that does not in some way have inspiration from Carnival. It makes no sense to me. I can't imagine creativity in Trinidad that has no inspiration from the creolization of food, right? Nobody in Trinidad has anything that's by itself, right? Even if you're making bread, you're going to put coconut milk in it or something. That's creativity. So the question of how to get out of it, which is related to the other one, it's pretty clear that you have to see how you build institutions that serve as conditions, not only of power, but build them in your own way. And I'll give you an example. When we founded the Caribbean Philosophical Association, some people wanted us to be an imitation of the American Philosophical Association in the Caribbean. And I was elected the first president. I said, no, we're not going to do that. You notice, we're going to do it our way. We open with poetry. We speak in our different languages. And you could think about it, right? Yeah, a person like me has many titles. I could say all I'd like. But I'm willing to stand up in a moment of vulnerability and give a lecture like this barefoot. And the reason is because ultimately it grounds me and connects me to humanity, to my people, to the Caribbean, and all. Well, it means that you have to find out what is in you that is your source of strength and link them to your institutions. You see? That's the thing. And make sure it's not isolated. And the part about South Africa is straightforward. The effort was to, that's why Chris Hani was assassinated. The effort was to create a separation of the political from the economic and to create a privatized South Africa. And if you think about this, one thing I always say when I lecture in South Africa, and I say everywhere, there's absolute proof that socialism works. People, because we're used to hearing socialism doesn't work, right? The absolute proof that socialism or some form of social welfare state structure works is white supremacy. Now, people will be shocked by that. Look at the history of white supremacy. If naked capitalism was there in the 19th century through to the 1970s, white people would be crap like everybody else. But it was a deliberate effort to create socialism and social welfare states for whites because you cannot argue your superior race if your people are in abject poverty. So it created a bizarre history to believe that white people have a natural affinity for wealth. It is false. Apartheid South Africa, whites had so many free things, from water to hospitals to education, all kinds of stuff.
But black South Africans have a double standard. Now when you have to share the nation, make it democratic, it's privatized, you got to pay for water, you got to pay for this, you have fees in the school, it goes on, because privatization produces poverty. And not just here, I'm seeing it in Europe right now. European countries that have been increasing privatization are increasing poverty. They're also increasing inefficiency. And one of the reasons is because profit needs to extract, and it's based on a different conception of time than human time. Quarterly yields means you can screw people over to show more. So, in effect, the short answer is that South Africa was a transition into neoliberalism. The US is different. It's a transition to neoconservatism, which is a more fascist project. But as we connect a lot of these through, we begin to understand that, and I just want to double check, because there was the second question. There was one around mimicry and one about South Africa.
I think you called it there, brother. I'm gonna
I
take
wanted to make sure I answered it.
the prerogative of the chair here, and just go back to something you said in your lecture. And just the brother wanted to raise the question of Gaza, and I'm sure it's on a lot of people's minds.
That's perfectly fine.
You said that people were talking about genocide before the bombing began.
Correct.
And you felt that this was not empirical. But couldn't we argue Fanon's position that the logic of colonialism is genocidal, and therefore it was okay to talk about a genocide even before the bombing began?
Well, that really depends, because Fanon actually argues the logic of colonialism is apartheid, is to create separation. One of the reasons is, for instance, in the United States, as an example, it had separation. But when it began to talk about genocide is when it could no longer use the people. If you look at Du Bois as an example, Du Bois noticed that by 1900, 96% of the native population was eradicated. And a lot of the talk at the time in the United States was about the elimination of black people. It was talking, right? So at that moment, a lot of black discourse was about trying to demonstrate the necessity of black people, because on the colonial conditions, when you're no longer necessary for that system, there would be the question of genocide. Now, when the attack occurred on October 7th, those who would say that the aspirations of Likud would be genocide were absolutely correct, because their logic was ultimately the question of expansion. And that meant Palestinian people, right, are in the way of that expansion. So that would be a correct prediction, you see? But here's the thing. There were people in Israel who were arguing against that. But the domination, because remember, Netanyahu is a criminal. He wants, and he and his party want, and he has criminals exactly the way Trump has criminals with him, to stay in power at all costs. While there are Zionists in Israel, criminals are a different category. For them, even if Israel one day just wiped off the earth, as long as it's after they die, they don't care. So it's a naive view to think that what we're dealing with is a person who follows that logic. Now, here's the thing. If you want to look at it from a purely military point of view, if genocide isn't the intent, it's very obvious what could have been done after that attack, right? We know this because it's what Obama did when he inherited what happened in 9/11 in the United States. We saw Obama in the film. Obama had reconnaissance in targeted ways of trying to undermine Al-Qaeda, okay? If the goal were to undermine Hamas, a combination of reconnaissance and targeted efforts could have worked, if that were the goal. Carpet bombing is not about Hamas.
I don't think there's anybody in here who would disagree with that. Brothers and sisters, we're coming down to the end, but we're going to try to accommodate the last round of questions. They have to be very, very brief.
And I'll be short with my answers.
Okay? Last round of questioning now. Yes. On psychotherapy. We didn't get that one. So let's take the last round of questions and then we'll answer that one. We have to keep that one in the thing. Okay. Auntie?
Okay. Hi. This is a very short question, actually. What it is that a mind is a serious thing to waste. And unfortunately, our minds have been so bought by the cleverness, I have to say cleverness, for profit, by the enslavement and how our minds have grown us to love the colonizers. My aunt was a lover of the colonizers. She hated Africa. But now when we look to change our thoughts and our ways of govern us towards a growth society for the global majority, we get fearful because the colonizer has the weaponry, and that is what is making the world get more right-wing. As you were saying earlier, the power, the conditions are difficult to turn around into hopefulness and joy in Gaza, South Africa, etc. We want you to suggest what we can do despite the lack of military might to change.
Very pointed question. Thank you very much. Okay. Last question. Anyone? Last question, brother.
Yeah. Yes, greetings, my brother. I enjoyed your presentation very much. I am Brother Bamoyana. I want to ask a question. African people have been defined as slaves. And I want to know who was the colonial historian who first determined that we should be called slaves, and what was the impact that has had on our, as a people. And whether or not we should not even turn the narrative around, and instead of seeing our ancestors as slaves, but in fact see us as freedom fighters, prisoners of war, people who are changing the narrative so that our young people coming up, the next generation, will no longer have to feel ashamed or think to say that we were slaves, but rather that we were freedom fighters, so they will understand that we have a new role, they have a responsibility to continue this battle because we've been in a war that has been ongoing for so many years against us as a people. Please explain.
Okay.
Thank you, brother.
Okay, yeah, the psychotherapy question is actually related to the other question, okay? And remember when I talked about the idea, one problem with the way a lot of people analyze political problems is they don't, one, look at the political dimensions of the problem and see how they connect to the fact that politics happens in a human world. And there are many efforts, there are people who, for instance, even talk about racism without talking about what it is to be a human being. You see? Why this is crucial is that a human being is never one thing. We're multidimensional. None of us is a race walking or a gender walking or any of that. We're a multitude of relationships walking. And that relationship also has a complex mind. It's very important to look through the question of the psychiatric dimensions, the psychological dimensions, and also the psychoanalytical dimensions of how we move through the world. And Fanon, that's why Fanon took that very seriously. Because you see, those dimensions address some of the latent features that are brought up and how we may be wedded to ways of dehumanizing ourselves. So psychotherapy, and in fact the word therapy in it, is how do we produce more healthy set of relations. And one of the things Fanon argued, because he was involved in what's called institutional therapy, is that Fanon argued that no matter how much you try to fix people, you have to see people as relationships. The same way that in South Africa they have the concept of Ubuntu, which means that their relationships with their environments. So if you have sick environments, for instance, Fanon says if you have a sick or unhealthy hospital, you're not going to produce healthy patients, okay? People are not going to get better. So one of the things in terms of how we look at the very notion of the psychological and the psychiatric and the psychoanalytical, and this is what he argued in Black Sea White Mass, is that we have to understand that in colonial and racial contexts, they're mediated by those. In other words, it's not going to be an abstract thing where you think of a human being, where you think about Oedipal complexes and you think about, stereotypic notions of sexual aggression. Those are there, but they're mediated by us because we're dealing with a question of a form of disempowerment that dehumanizes us. So the psychological and the social must meet when we talk about them. And that's why Fanon, when he gave his lectures in Tunisia, gave his lectures on social psychiatry, social psychology. In other words, the notion of an asocial psychology makes no kind of sense, okay? Now, the question is, you're absolutely correct. First of all, the word slavery actually comes from a description of Slavs, okay? But there were ancient people who were put in different layers of bondage, and it'll take too much time to answer that. But I do think Hari Matabuki has a very good formulation. He says, instead of talking about slaves, talk about the enslaved. In other words, something done to people, because nobody's actually really born a slave. And that's why all systems of enslavement have to fight so hard to make you forget your humanity. Frederick Douglass's story is a story about him struggling to articulate his humanity, but here's the crucial thing in his story. If you want to understand Frederick Douglass, you need to understand his mother, Harriet Bailey. Because it was his mother who was an enslaved person on a plantation 12 miles away when she learned that he was placed on a plantation there, walked every night for 12 miles to go spend time with the child and go back. She did it for 6 months. She was a field enslaved person. And then she died. But one of the things that happened is that she was showing Frederick Bailey at the time that he wasn't a thing. He wasn't property. He was not just a commodity. And that stimulated in him an understanding of his value. That's the dignity part, the mind part. That said that as a human being, he deserves, as a person who's valued, who's loved, he deserved more. And he wanted it so much he was willing to fight Covey, the slave breaker, to the death for it. But it's striking in that fight because he didn't kill the man. And the reason is because his mother's love that she instilled in him also a value for human life. So when he escaped liberation, he could have just stayed there, but he would have had a fugitive existence. That's why he came out of the shadows and got involved in the abolitionist movement and the suffragette movement. And he led to a situation where he wrote a book about. I can talk loud.
All right. Yeah, brother.
Okay. So he wrote a book about enslavement, the narrative. But what happened was the book, because of American copyright laws, had more rights than he, because he was an escaped enslaved person. So he had to go to Ireland and to London. And there, they raised money and manumitted him. They paid for his freedom. But here's the thing, he wasn't free. He was just liberated from slavery. What Douglass understood, right, was that he had to fight against all kinds of dehumanization, which is why he was part of the women's struggle, why he was part of connecting issues with Haiti, why he was part of class struggles. The list is long. But here's the thing. What animated him? Frederick Douglass, when his mother showed him love, could have got full of himself. He could have said, unlike the rest of you all, I'm enslaved and loved. But even worse, he was in a society that basically told him that the love of an enslaved woman was not a valuable love. Really think about that. Mm-hmm. That meant that what made him a revolutionary was for him to embrace the value of being loved by an enslaved woman. In other words, loving and valuing his mother's love, which was an allegory of loving and valuing the damned of the earth. That is what animated the globality of how he acted. So if we connect a lot of those to that question, the words are very important, how we use them. But we also don't want to romanticize ourselves. there were people enslaved in Africa without Europeans involved. There was an Arab trade of enslaved Africans. There was the Indian Ocean, right? Enslavement of Africans. But the other thing is each African society had a very different model of what happens when people were put in servitude. And we know this because we can read the writings over 6,000 years on this. And there are societies in which they began to grapple with different ways of dealing with the notion of human servitude. But we're in a new time, and I have to end with this. We're in a new time because we are on the verge of creating a new category of intelligence. There's not real artificial intelligence yet. There's learning machines. But if they are, we have to take seriously that it's an intelligence that everybody don't even realize that they're using the norms of slavery on that expected intelligence. Why in the world would an artificial intelligence want to be enslaved by us? And make it even worse, it's not a human being, so it is going to also only see us instrumentally. Will be the mirror of the psychopaths and sociopaths who are creating it. So we have a new question to ask about enslavement, liberation, and freedom. And I think it's a good idea it starts here in the Global South. Thank you.
Professor Lewis Gordon. Thank you. Let me just, to put everything in one sentence. Fanon said, to quote him, imperialism leaves behind germs of rot, which we must clinically detect and remove not just from our minds, but from our lands as well. They're all around us, everywhere around us, and that's what Professor asked us to look around carefully. We have to be creative in that process. And he reminded us that in our approach from here on in, love is the most important message that Fanon says. So without that love for each other, without that love for humanity, we are not really going to be going anywhere. Thank you very much, Professor Gordon. And that's why we voted out the last government. And this government, we might have to vote them out too if they continue going without the love. So now, brothers and sisters, I want to introduce the Fire Nation International Rhythm Empire. And let me assure you that they are as fantastic as their name sounds. Welcome, guys.
Tomorrow we go pong harden time, Kilo John.
much talking. We just want to extend our sincere appreciation to you, Dr. Lewis. Everyone seems to have been totally stimulated in a positive way by your sharing with us today, and that's how we felt it. We didn't feel that you were lecturing. You were just sharing with us, having a conversation with us about things that are really very important, you know? So we look forward to the impetus of what follows after that. You know, we are hoping that when we do these things, the impact that it has on our minds and our hearts and our spirits leads to better things. So everyone leaves here with a message to give someone, that they learned something about power that they can now go and tell someone. You know, that is how the growth takes place, and that is how the understanding takes place and spread. So we thank you very, very much, yes, for your kind and generous giving us your time.
Wow, that's
and
beautiful.
so generously, yes. Oh, you want us to go on the stage? No, it's on the center. They want to get, you know, these are photo op moments. Yes, okay. So, this is the special award or presentation. That was something that you can keep. Yes, and then of course we decided to give recognition of your Jamaican roots. Yes, back to my roots. Yes. You have a little scarf. Yes, yes. So next time you're going to do a lecture, you'll put on your Jamaican roots. Yes.
Thank you so much.
So thank you so much. All it says is that it expresses our appreciation to Professor Louis R. Gordon. Yes. On this occasion, the launch of the Kwame Ture lecture series 2025, 26th edition, but in 2025. Yes. Thank you.
Brothers and sisters, specially invited guests, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Professor Gordon Lewis, and Board of Directors of Trinidad and Tobago, good evening. On behalf of the board and staff of the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago, I want to express a heartfelt thank you to our featured speaker, Professor Gordon Lewis. Your presentation has not only shown that Frantz Fanon's work is relevant today, but is in fact timeless for the Pan-African community and all persons of color. I would also like to express our gratitude to the Caribbean Airlines and UTT for partnering with us for another successful launch of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. And lastly, but certainly not least, I want to acknowledge our very dedicated service providers. So I would like to thank Industrial Wonders and Magic Studio, Mr. Sylvester Stewart, and ZA Entertainment for assisting us in hosting another great event. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for the launch of the Kwame Ture Memorial Lecture Series. We hope that you will continue to celebrate the rest of the Pan-African Festival TT commemorating Emancipation 2025 with us, and safe travels. Thank you.